Hello, my name is Daniel Zeese, and I'm the curator for the Ellen Noel Art Museum, and thank you for joining us in celebrating Tom Lea Month. Tonight we'll be hosting a panel discussion about our Tom Lea mural entitled Stampede. I'll go ahead and introduce our panel. First, we have educator Trudy Lewis. She's also a board member of the Ellen Noel Art Museum, as well as a board member of the Tom Lea Institute. We also have assistant professor of art history, Melissa Warak, from the University of Texas at El Paso. And then finally, we have Adair Margo, founding director for the Tom Lea Institute. So thank you, ladies, for joining us, and thank you for doing that this for us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Adair, do you think would you like to get started and tell us a little bit about Tom Lea and whatnot?
No, what we kind of decided, since we've got, Tom Lea did a book called A Picture Gallery in 1968. And so for the viewers, we thought the best way to start, when you have words by Tom Lea, you tend to just take them as they are and read them. And I think that'll set up the discussion very nicely. So I was going to take a few minutes to just read from A Picture Gallery about the Longhorns. We bought, it starts on page 35, we bought a white stucco house on Reynolds Boulevard in the spring of 1940 and had a home of our own with a mortgage instead of rent to pay. In those days, our street was at the very edge of town. In back of our house, the mesquite-speckled boondocks began right at our property line and extended with all the sandy and solitary elbow room any lizard or coyote or artist could want, at least halfway to Fort Worth. 20 paces from our back porch, we built a studio. It was like a big box with rock walls and a flat roof. Inside, there was plenty of room and plenty of light. The ceiling was 14 feet above the concrete floor. A grand north light came in from a window 10 feet tall and 18 feet wide. John Norton's big easel looked small there. It was altogether the right workroom for a mural painter, complete with a scaffold on ball-bearing rollers. The first work I did there was on the easel, a mural design in 1-inch scale. I called it Stampede. It was for a new post office at Odessa, Texas, about 70 miles from a crossing of the Pecos River. The first verse of Little Joe the Wrangler was easy to remember. We was camping on the Pecos when the wind began to blow, and we doubled up the guard to hold them tight. When the storm came roaring from the north with thunder and with rain, and the herd stampeded off into the night. Snuffy cattle, epic times of drivers on long trails were alive and kicking in my mind. Frank Dobie had just sent me carbon copies of several chapters from his new book, The Longhorns. He was finishing the long labor with the manuscript, polishing the final draft, and I already had the good news that his publishers in Boston would let me illustrate the book. In preparation for that work, I had conceived of a color painting of a stampede as a part of it. I had spent a good deal of time that spring studying and diagramming the anatomy of cow brutes, attending the local rodeo to freshen my eye with the way a bull jumped and a steer ran, visiting the local stockyards to look sharp at cattle shipments from Chihuahua. Some of the Corrientes showed the rangy frame, the motley colors, the well-grown horns of the old Texas type. I had stretched the big inviting piece of well-primed linen canvas on the pristine blankness of my new studio wall, working up the nerve to start a hell-bent stampede out of a paint box when a letter came from Frank Dobie. He wanted to know if I would care to join him on a prowl to see longhorns and look at brush country. And I'm going to skip the next part, but in that part of the picture gallery, he describes exactly where they went down in the brush country of South Texas looking at longhorns. But after he elaborates on all of that, he said, then Frank drove on to Montana. I took a train home to El Paso to my wife, Sarah, and our son, Jim. I was honing to paint a stampede with thunder and lightning in my new studio. Horned cattle seemed to know how to flow from the point of a brush that fall of 1940. I completed the Stampede mural on the 5th of October. On the 7th, I put away the bristle brushes and paint tubes, uncorked a bottle of India ink, touched a number 00 sable brush to a smooth sheet of paper, and began a chapter head drawing for Chapter 1, The Longhorns. In the middle of November, when the paint on the Stampede canvas was dry enough, I halted the ardors of work with the 00 brush and made a trip with my friend Alex Stevens, who was driving to Odessa on other business to install the mural. We looked like itinerant sign painters with buckets, brushes, rags, sponges, tools, cans of white lead, Venice turpentine, spar varnish loaded in the car. The mural itself rolled on a long pasteboard roller and wrapped in oilcloth looked like the stump end of a big flagpole sticking out the window of a Chevy sedan. We got to Odessa after dark and found no reception committee or any band music waiting for us at the post office. We did find the janitor and persuaded him, after flashing a letter signed Chief Section of Fine Arts, Treasury Department, to lend us a couple of step ladders. Alex, I drafted him on the spot, and I went to work, stirring up my white lead adhesive goo formula, applying it vigorously, then to the plaster wall and to the back of the canvas, which we unrolled on the floor. It was past midnight when we finally finished persuading and massaging the canvas firmly on the wall plaster. We trimmed the edges, we tidied up the lobby, we wiped the sweat from our faces very neatly, terminating the ceremonial formalities of installing a work of art in a federal building by the light of a single electric globe shining late and lonesome over the mail chute marked local. Next morning, citizens of Odessa found a herd of longhorns coming at them from over the stamp windows. Alex and I were on our way back across the Pecos, headed for the Rio Grande, and more longhorns waiting on my drawing board. So I'm going to end there, and Trudy, I think, can talk a little bit about that building where it no longer is, but when it was first installed, that's what people saw when they came in, seeing these longhorns rushing at them.
They did. They certainly did. And, you know, of course, I wasn't here at that time, but the post office was, until that particular post office was used until 1970. And I do have friends who said when they were little children that a friend said he remembered going with his mother to the post office, and he said he was so terrified. He was about 4 years old, of seeing those huge cattle. And if you see the mural, it is kind of a frightening scene. So the mural was there above eye level, because it was a one-story building but tall ceilings, and so you'd look up to see the mural. And then of course the building became old. It's still there, but the city, or in the county, there was a new post office constructed in 1970. And when that happened, then the mural was moved, and across the street actually. And the new building is a lower ceiling building, so the mural was in place there as well, but then at eye level, and with just a small kind of a railing in front of it, so you could always see it, but it was in a much more vulnerable position, and maybe not quite the place that Tom Lea had envisioned for it. And so over the years, unfortunately, because post office are open 24 hours a day, the mural was damaged. And so for years, people had thought about, would there be a way to protect that mural, because it's such a powerful image and so much a part of the memories and experiences of so many people in Odessa. And so people had talked, because the mural actually belongs to the federal government, to the post office. And they tried to contact them, and there really was no success. There always the word was that no, the mural is in the post office and that's where it must stay. And so we'd worked on that for years, and people just, over the years, many people had made attempts at different times to see if there was some way to protect that mural and make it a little bit more accessible not accessible to the public, but easier for the public to view, perhaps. And so with the help of the Tom Lea Institute and the Ella Noel Art Museum in 2014, I believe that was, a group of citizens from Odessa and El Paso went to Washington, D.C. for a conference on murals, and our mural was the one that was highlighted, and what murals mean to the community at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, what these murals mean to a community, and the importance of preserving them and how that might be accomplished. And so that really began a conversation, and it is a conversation that's ongoing for other communities as well, because there were others there from other parts of the country who were interested in the same kind of study. And through that work, then the federal government agreed to allow Odessans to become more actively involved in protecting the mural. And so the mural was removed from the post office with the assistance of the Ella Noel Art Museum and and others in Odessa, other art association, the Odessa Arts Association, and a replica was put in its place. So there is still a replica of the mural in the actual spot in the 1970s post office. And then the mural was taken to Santa Fe to be restored, beautifully restored and cleaned, and now has pride of place in the art museum, the Ella Noel Art Museum in Odessa. So such a valuable part of our community.
And Trudy, you used to take your students there too as a teacher, wasn't that part of your teaching?
It was. Well, the story of the mural really ties in with the story of the Great Depression and how part of the New Deal, although it's not directly part, but a part of the idea of the New Deal was to help all areas of the economy, come back from the vicissitudes of the Great Depression. And so I would tell my students that part of that story was in Odessa. And so I was an American history teacher, and I would encourage them to go. It was close. I taught at Odessa High School, and the post office is not very far away. So that's when the mural was still in the post office. And I would always have them go to the museum, go to the post office and look at the mural, and then they had to come back and tell me about it. And they really enjoyed that. And it was so powerful to me too, because it gave them a connection to their community and also to their history. And many of the students had not seen the mural. You can go into the post office and never see the mural, because that post office was not built with the mural in mind. So you would always have to make a U-turn to even know that it was there. And they would always come back with these wonderful stories. I always remember, of course, how many horns there are in the mural. And then students would come back, and one thing I had not noticed is that some of the cattle have red eyes and some of the cattle have green eyes. And they would always come back and say, why is that? Why is that? And of course, I never had the opportunity to ask Tom Lea why he had portrayed them in that way. Artistic license, I would always say. But, and I'm proud to say my own daughter, Eleanor, was a U.S. history teacher here in Odessa last year, and she had her students go to the Ella Noel Art Museum and visit the mural there and talk and learn about its history, its story, and its connection to American history as well.
Right. It is. It's wonderful to know what's in your own community and the fact that how significant it is. It was a
It
model
is.
conference at
Yes.
Estonia.
And especially because our community doesn't have a really old history. And so, when you can find a connection like that, I think it's so important and valuable to everyone, but especially the young people in the community.
And we have Melissa Warak too, who's an art historian. And you say your history is not that old, but of course the tradition of mural painting, especially classic mural painting. We've at the Tom Lea Institute, we heard from an Italian art historian, and Melissa, I think, knew Luciano Cellis. But you want to talk a little bit about its significance as far as the Renaissance and periods where murals really spoke loudly on walls, Melissa, just like this was doing in Odessa today.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to say, actually, I think that one of the very fortunate things for Odessa is that the mural is not fresco. It is painted on oil. And so that would make it much more portable than a fresco would have been. So where you would literally have to cut out the wall in order to move it. So, and that's actually the same case that we have with the Pass of the North mural, which is in El Paso. So that one is also on oil. And so I think that if you think about it, so this was a moment where there was a real revival of muralism. And I think that this was also spurred in part by the Mexican muralists of the Mexican Revolution. And so we have major artists, Jackson Pollock, Philip Guston, many others who, like Tom Lea, were hired by the US government to create murals. And so they did also, so the Department of the Treasury also had oil painting, sculpture, and many prints and posters and things like that also created for the Federal Art Project. But in general, people really get to know the murals. And so this was an opportunity for many artists like Tom Lea to get to look back to this kind of work that had been done, not just for, centuries, but like for millennia, because some of the earliest prehistoric art that we have is our wall paintings, right? So this is sort of like going back to some of the earliest art that we know, even relating to rock art and those sorts of things. So in the Renaissance, you would have more fresco painting. So what happens with fresco painting is that you are literally painting on top of plaster on a wall. So you cannot wash off or scrub off the work because it becomes fused with the wall, and it's a chemical process that uses lime and other pretty noxious chemicals, generally speaking. So this was a great opportunity for Lea and many others who were engaged with mural painting to work on a really large scale. And I think that fits with a lot of his own ideas too, because he was very interested in the history of Texas, which of course is an enormous state, right? So he was the enormity of the landscape around Texas was something that was very interesting to him. And so being able to work with these very large scale murals, and the Stampede is, I believe, over 17 feet long or wide. So it will really fill up your peripheral vision. And I think that was a very intentional goal. And as Trudy pointed out, the number of horns that you see, he was trying to sort of show the magnitude of this event of a stampede, basically. And I think that also another thing for me that's very interesting is there's one person and one horse in the Stampede. And this is sort of a death scene for this guy. I mean, nobody could survive this kind of fall. If the horse didn't kill him, the longhorn would, right? So it's not exactly a happy sort of image. And for me, I think that might be why we have those red eyes, that it's almost like these cattle are sort of possessed in a way when they're on a stampede. Like all they know is fear or rage, whatever it is, and they're sort of going forward. So I think that in this way, Lee was really trying to access this idea of the expanse of the West, and especially in West Texas. He was thinking about the history of the cattle drives that would go through the river 70 miles. I'm not sure which direction it is, I think west of Odessa. So to me, it really does fall in line with these really kind of grandiose action schemes that you would see in murals past.
The significance, I was saying about that red and green, I mean, you see in churches up in New Mexico, you see red and green details in churches. And what's the significance of those two colors in the history of art, red and green?
I mean, well, red has a very long history, and actually a lot of images that we see that have reds, especially from the far past, have faded, and they might look a little bit more pink or something like that. Red was a color that was very rare, and it was a very expensive pigment, and so materially, that wouldn't have been the same case for Lee, of course, but materially in ages past, if you wanted a really true red, it would have kind of added significantly to the price for the patron of the work. And red is often seen as a very, a color of passion, maybe anger, that sort of thing. Green, on the other hand, is usually a sort of shorthand for nature. So we have examples of other modernist artists. One of my favorites is the Dutch artist Piet Mondrian, and he never painted with green because he said, everybody will automatically think you're doing a landscape, like it's a natural scene. So for me, those were probably sort of the two kind of most basic associations with those particular colors. But I will point out for anybody who gets to go see the mural, that this is a nighttime scene also. So we don't have a lot of the kind of daylight color effects that we might normally have. But Lee was very interested in the sort of musculature, the skin tone, and the fur. And so we have a lot of these like kind of speckled or spotted longhorns, and there's a lot of detail that goes into these animals. So his studies of anatomy, to me, are also very interesting because they really do go back to somebody like Leonardo da Vinci, who worked so tirelessly to try to understand the motion and the musculature and this skeletal properties of all of these animals. And so for me, that's another way that Lee really fits into this kind of as an inheritor of some of the Renaissance ideals. So it's a very long answer to your question about red and green.
You mentioned...
Well, and it's also true, I was going to just chime in that since that painting has been cleaned, those colors are much more vibrant than they were. I think some of the photographs that we have are older photographs, the unrestored mural. And since it has been cleaned, those eyes are bright red and bright green. I was surprised. And so it's quite powerful. And even though it is a nighttime scene, the colors are vivid. At least those colors are.
Yeah.
Tom actually said, I think he would have liked to be a fresco painter. That was kind of his style. I mean, but he would paint on canvas as if it were fresco. But you mentioned the canvas. And of course, one thing I wanted to ask you, Melissa, Tom Lea was, I think, unusual for the New Deal. I'm not sure how many of those painters were actually trained as muralists. Many were easel painters who then had the opportunity to blow their work up into larger scale for public buildings. But he had been in Chicago during a boom in building with Holabird and Root buildings. And of course, when they were building those, they didn't want someone to then go in and paint on the wall. He painted in a great big studio on canvas so that the painting was ready to go up, just like he did Stampede, and then realized too that if a building were remodeled, you could move it where you might otherwise lose it. But how many, I mean, I've just in the research I've done and the murals I've seen, and when Dana Joy, chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, saw our mural out in El Paso, he said it's the finest of the period. Not really realizing that Tom Lea was trained by John Warner Norton, who did murals in Chicago and was prepared to do really excellent work by himself. So would you know about that, Melissa, as far as the other New Deal painters?
I couldn't give you specific numbers of the artists, but I think you're absolutely correct that most of them were trained, just as painters. So they were used to working on an easel scale. And I think that we do see, I can think of murals by John Stewart Curry, for example, where there's clearly there were some problems with working on that large of a scale. So I think that was certainly that training with Norton was a great benefit for Lea, because he was able to make these, I'll say in the Paso the North, they're supposed to be giants, right? And they're enormous figures. I mean, much larger than life size. And I think that he was able to do the other trick of this is they had to work quickly. So they didn't have, years on end to do this. And Fresco is messy. It is something that would require probably not having people come into the building. So it's probably not so practical for the type of works that most of these artists were doing, especially in a place like Chicago. If it's a new building, it's busy, and they probably don't want to shut down operations just for the painting of frescoes, right? So I think it was a sort of a smart choice. Fresco's harder to work with because it dries very quickly, so you can't get the level of detail. I mean, it's just sort of a known thing. You just can't get the same level of detail. And Lea does talk in his writings about, allowing the paint to dry, and this was over a month, So I think that's the real benefit, is that we can get these really vibrant colors and this kind of sense of depth and the highlighting that he does, especially on that very large, I'm going to say it's a bull, but there's no anatomical evidence of that necessarily, but it might be a steer, but I think it's a bull, probably the very large black one in the very front of the mural. And he's almost a blue-black. I mean, it's a really kind of an interesting choice, I think, kind of highlighting that animal's anatomy. And I did a little bit of research because I was really interested in this idea that Tom Lea had about what he called the old style of longhorn cattle. And I'm a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, so I'm very accustomed to a very beefy, fat, kind of slow longhorn cow. And the old style were, and he actually used this word, rangy. They were very slim. They were much faster. They could move faster, and they weren't, necessarily bred just for beef the way that more cattle are these days. So this is why, if you look at those cows in the Stampede, they look probably younger to most people who don't know, because they are probably mature cows. They just were bred to be more lean. And so this was a choice. And so that's really, I think, one of the things that's interesting is that he's thinking about, this kind of old breed that was really dying out in 1940, because breeders were packing on the pounds on these larger animals. It's sort of like a Cadillac versus a Ferrari or something like that, right? So I think it was a really kind of an interesting stylistic choice that he made to show these cattle as they were. So it's a little bit like an homage to the past, I think, also for Texas. And he also said he chose between painting. He had to make this sort of choice when he got the commission between painting cattle or oil fields or something related to the oil industry. And so I think I'm actually kind of curious, maybe Trudy can answer this. what difference do you think it would have meant to Odessans if he had done something related to the oil industry versus the cows?
I think both images or both scenes would have been well received. I think this one, it becomes particularly valuable, and I think much better as it turned out. Of course, he was influenced too by that he was going to be working on the illustrations for J. Frank Dobie's book, The Longhorns, and I think that helped him make his decision as well. But I've always really been fascinated by his use of the story of Little Joe the Wrangler, and I think that really turned out to be a wonderful choice, because if you listen to the music and or read the lyrics, it's an old cowboy story song. And it involves a young man who's really kind of orphaned. I should say his mother has died, but his father is remarried, and he's not happy at home. And so he goes out to try and find a new life for himself, and he has nothing. And so the cowboys take him in, and they kind of help him get the things that he needs. And he becomes part of the group and is making a better life for himself. And then, of course, the great tragedy is he's killed in this stampede. But I just think that's such a powerful story, and it really speaks to the history of Odessa in the sense that people come here looking for a better life, and they come from all over. You know, this was an arid land for years, and not much activity, economic activity. And so I think the image that he chose was a wonderful one, and I think very well received, always was and has been, continues to be, because it's not just a story of cattle stampeding, but it's also a story of someone looking for a better life, and that's a powerful story as well.
Trudy, you had mentioned you're on the board of the Tom Lea Institute, and our theme is Amistad this year,
Yes.
Friendship. And do you want to say a little bit about the friendship between J. Frank Dobie and Tom Lea?
Well, I think one of the events is going to delve into that story a little bit more. But I know I think already discussed this. It was the beginning of 1940 that Tom Lea found out that he was going to be allowed to make this mural, and that he was thinking of what he might do. And he certainly was thinking of an oil-related scene. And but then through his friendship with J. Frank Dobie, then he had the opportunity to go out and observe the cattle. And then he began to think about the fact that Odessa was not very far from the cattle drives and from Horsehead Crossing, which is the crossing on the Pecos River to the south and west of Odessa. And that would have been an important part of the history as well. And so I think it really was through his friendship with Frank Dobie that he developed the idea of the mural for Odessa. And so Amistad is the theme of Tom Lea Month this year. And I think this mural speaks to that story as well.
You know, Tom always said that his opportunities came from his friends. And J. Frank Dobie was actually a friend of his dad's, Mayor Tom Lea, 1915 to 1917 in El Paso, and a very interesting man. And I think Tom, really loved J. Frank Dobie. He introduced him to the real thing, like going down and traveling in the brush country. And that's another thing about Tom, I think, is his interest in life. I mean, I've always said Tom Lea didn't function in the art world, he functioned in the whole world. And he was interested in what interested other people, and cattle being one of them. And so I love hearing Melissa talking about the old breed and all those details. Really, you never can exhaust when you're looking at real life and trying to capture real life and what the rangy type were like versus how they were bred later on. I mean, it opens up. He used his art to explore life. And he always said he was interested. He wanted people to recognize his subject. People who knew cattle, he wanted them to recognize them rather than his style. So that sets Tom Lea apart from many 20th century artists.
I do want to point out, though, like one of the things that struck me when I looked at this mural is that, so this was a mural that was created just 3 years after Pablo Picasso's mural Guernica, which was a worldwide hit. It was exhibited in Paris.
Mhm.
And this was, of course, an anti-war mural by Picasso. But very interestingly, I think Picasso included these images of bulls and horses, and he has a horse that is dying. And there is a way
Mhm.
that I think if you look at these two sort of next to each other, that you can see a little bit of that in the horse, especially because the horse has been killed in Guernica, and this horse is in distress in Stampede. And so even though Adair says, he wasn't, like a player in the art world in the same way, he was very aware of these sorts of things. I mean, you really couldn't have you would have had to be very sort of purposely not paying attention if you didn't know about this particular work at that time. And so I think that there is this other kind of lineage that we can think about, that maybe he was thinking about what the symbolism was for others as well, right? So in Spain, the bull is often seen as a symbol for Spain. And of course, in El Paso, we have very strong ties to the history of Spain because of colonialism. And that was something that Lee wrote about in his novels. He was very interested in these histories. So I think that there's this kind of great sort of continuity that we can see, not just with mural painting, but also with some of the symbolism maybe that is part of this, that it is a sad story, as Trudy said. It's not that uplifting, really, this story of the Wrangler. And truly, it's an image of the working class, which maybe was not what Lee had intended at the time.
It is.
But I think that this is something that is another strain that we see through a lot of his works, is that he was depicting workers, and that was something that was really valued in 1940.
Absolutely. All of it. Very interesting.
So, Adair, do you have any closing thoughts about the mural that we can kind of end with?
Well, I'd like to end with where Trudy kind of started, is that Odessa, in really trying to preserve this part of its heritage, was the feature at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in 2014, I think Trudy said. But really the leader in beginning, because we invited, what was his name, Trudy, from the U.S. Postal Service, who had been in El Paso. We invited people, all the players were there at that conference. But
Daniel Delahaye, or
Daniel Delahaye, yes, who had been in El Paso actually. But they were really the leaders in getting a signed agreement between a community to become a steward of the government property and pay to have it. You all worked, the Ellen Noel Museum also worked with another organization, right, Trudy? Yes. Daniel, it
was Odessa Arts, which
Odessa Arts.
Odessa Arts. The whole community came together to preserve this.
Yes.
So really, it's a model for the rest of the country of what can be done. Okay, so for decades, people tried to make calls and never made a connection. It's possible, right? You all proved that it's possible. And you were one of the speakers there, Trudy, a very convincing school teacher talking about the importance of that mural to your students. So my hat is off to what you all did. And, it's comforting. In fact, my son just wrote and said, I want a print of that. That is an awesome mural. All of we see it for the first time. I want a print for my house. So the Tom Lea Institute is looking at, trying to do a print of it. But it just will live on and on. But it wouldn't have if the community didn't care. And if the community hadn't stepped up and made this restoration and a new locale, safe locale in the Ellen Noel Museum possible. So my hat's off to Odessa.
Thank you. Well, thank you, ladies. I really appreciate you coming together today so we could do this. And for our people viewing this, the museum is open from Tuesday to Sunday, from noon to 5, and on Thursdays we're open till 8. Okay, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you
you.
very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you.